It began with a shriek that cut through the summer stillness like shears through silk. In the village of Merton Flory, where roses bloomed in neatly trimmed hedges and elderly ladies made jam in orderly kitchens, such sounds were rare enough to bring half the street running. Mrs. Tilling, whose voice had caused the commotion, stood trembling beside the wrought iron gate of Hawthorne Grange, clutching her shopping basket as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. "I saw him," she gasped to the constable, who was already unlatching the gate. "Right there. He was lying in the garden, but when I looked again, gone. Vanished like smoke." The garden, known locally as Mrs. Dalrymple's Folly, stretched in wild, unruly elegance behind the old Georgian house. It was an eccentric maze of hedges, twisting paths, arbors draped with honeysuckle, and small sculptures in white marble. Mrs. Honoria Dalrymple, a retired botanist and lover of rare flora, had allowed her garden to grow into something more akin to an overgrown wonderland than a proper English plot. By the time Inspector Andrew Pettigrew arrived that afternoon, the house had been cordoned off, the villagers dispersed, and Mrs. Dalrymple, pale but composed, was seated in her drawing-room with a pot of tea and an agitated cat on her lap. Pettigrew, balding, methodical, and prone to ulcers, had seen many strange cases, but none quite like this. "There was blood," he said, after the initial pleasantries. The constable found a smear on one of the marble cherubs. "But no body?" Mrs. Dalrymple nodded. "Yes, I rather assumed you'd find that. I saw it myself. But I was in the house all morning. My gardener's away this week, and the only person who's come by was young Mr. Bayliss, the antiquarian from the village shop." Pettigrew frowned. The garden had only one gate, the one through which Mrs. Tilling had entered. There were no signs of forced entry, no prints in the soft earth, and, most perplexingly, no footprints leading away from the patch of blood. Just a narrow clearing beneath a twisted hazel tree, and then nothing. No sign of a struggle, no dragging marks, no trail at all. It was as though the victim had evaporated. He walked the garden twice, then a third time. Each path doubled back on itself. Hidden doors, perhaps. Trapdoors. But the earth was undisturbed. Every oddity he considered only led to more confusion. By late afternoon, the missing man had been identified. Walter Kerridge, a well-known botanical illustrator who had recently arrived in the village to catalogue Mrs. Dalrymple's collection of rare plants. He was last seen 2 days prior, sketching orchids by the koi pond. His rucksack and sketchbook were found under a garden bench. Both were clean, untouched by rain or blood. Perhaps he staged it, offered Sergeant Lacey, looking dubious, to disappear. Some kind of dramatic exit. Possibly, Pettigrew replied, though he didn't believe it. But to what end? There's no reason for him to vanish, and no one's heard a word from him. The following morning, another clue appeared. A footprint. One solitary impression in a flower bed near the hazel tree, small and precise, made by a leather-soled shoe. It hadn't been there the day before, and no police officer claimed responsibility for it. Pettigrew crouched beside it, frowning. One footprint, not two, not leading in or out, just one. Missed one. Dalrymple, summoned again, inspected it with a cool gaze. "Not mine," she said, "and certainly not the sort of shoe Walter wore. He had heavy boots. That print is from something finer." A theory formed in Pettigrew's mind. Ridiculous, perhaps, but unavoidable. Someone was entering and leaving the garden without using the paths. But how? There were no trees close enough to climb over the wall, no tunnels, and the hedges were too dense to push through unnoticed. He ordered a close inspection of the marble cherub, where the blood had first been seen. A crack in the pedestal revealed a curious thing. a tiny lever concealed within the design. When pressed, it clicked. Nothing happened. Except, 20 feet away, one of the flagstones beside the koi pond shifted a hair's breadth. They pried it open. Beneath was a descending shaft, dry and lined with stone, leading into darkness. Lanterns were fetched. Pettigrew, Lacey, and a constable named Ford descended, finding a narrow tunnel that twisted under the garden, opening at last into a cramped chamber filled with dust, cobwebs, and Walter Kerridge. Alive. He was dazed, bruised, and tied to a chair, but alive. Later, in the warmth of the drawing room, he explained through cracked lips. I heard something strange near the pond, a clicking noise. I turned and someone hit me from behind. When I came to, I was here. I've no idea how long. But why? Pettigrew asked. Who would do this? Walter blinked, then nodded slowly. I think it was about the orchid. The Amaranthus sanguinis. Mrs. Dalrymple has one. I showed Bayliss my sketches. He was oddly excited, asked if I'd part with them. Pettigrew straightened. Bayliss, the antiquarian. That evening, they found Bayliss trying to board a bus with a suitcase full of rare plant cuttings, forged botanical documents, and Walter's missing field sketches. He confessed quickly. He had hoped to steal the orchid and sell the drawings to a collector abroad. The underground chamber had once been a smuggler's tunnel, long forgotten. He'd discovered it while researching local history and modified the cherub mechanism to open the old hatch. Walter had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The garden had no vanishing footsteps, only cleverly hidden entrances, and a crime born from greed and botanical obsession. As Bayliss was led away, Mrs. Dalrymple remarked dryly, Really, I suppose it's a compliment. Not everyone has a garden worth stealing from. Inspector Pettigrew, brushing dirt from his coat, allowed himself a rare smile. No, madam. Not everyone has a garden where footsteps vanish and secrets bloom. Inspector Pettigrew, despite having resolved the immediate mystery, could not dismiss a lingering disquiet. The confession had been too swift, too neat, and Bayliss, while clearly guilty of something, had left threads dangling, too many unanswered whys. Why leave the field sketches behind? Why not take the orchid itself? And most curiously of all, why return to the scene that morning, knowing the police were combing the grounds? He sent word to London for assistance, not because he couldn't manage, but because, beneath his cautious exterior, Pettigrew trusted his instincts. They told him something didn't sit right. 3 days later, a tall woman stepped off the afternoon train, carrying a small leather case and an umbrella she clearly had no intention of using. Miss Theodora Vane was not a detective by profession, at least not officially. She styled herself as an independent inquirer, and her name had cropped up in the more thoughtful police circles. Pettigrew met her at the station, hat in hand, unsure what to expect. She greeted him with a curt nod and no small dose of amusement in her eyes. I gather we have a vanishing man, a hidden tunnel, and a suspicious antiquarian who confessed a bit too easily. Pettigrew blinked. Yes, well, I suppose that's the case. Good, she said, already walking. I've always liked gardens, they're full of lies. At Hawthorne Grange, Theodora declined tea and instead walked the garden alone. She moved slowly, hands behind her back, taking no notes. The constables had already swept the grounds twice, and yet she crouched to inspect moss on a bench, peeled back a curtain of ivy behind a statue, and even sniffed the petals of a drooping blue gentian with the air of someone reading a coded message. She said little until they reached the koi pond. This, she murmured, crouching beside the flagstones, was the entry point. Pettigrew nodded. The cherub lever opens a hatch just there. And Walter Kerridge, tied up below, says he never saw his attacker. Only the back of a head. He assumed it was Baylis, the voice matched. Theodora straightened. Did anyone confirm the tunnel's age? Pettigrew hesitated. It's assumed to be Victorian. Smugglers, perhaps. The house is older still? Then why? She said, tapping a finger on the hatch. Does the iron hinge show signs of recent welding? Pettigrew blinked. Welding? She pointed to the seam, clean, sharp, almost new. This trapdoor has been reinforced recently. By someone with access to metalwork. Not something an idle bookseller does lightly. That evening, she asked to see Walter Kerridge. He had been recovering in the vicarage, under the watch of the village nurse. A gentleman in his late 40s, with ink-stained fingers and a hesitance in his voice, Walter still bore the bruises from his ordeal. I suppose I was lucky, he said. If Mrs. Dalrymple hadn't called for help, I might have been left there for days. Did Baylis ever mention the tunnel to you? Theodora asked. He shook his head. No. Though I did wonder why he kept asking to meet me in the garden instead of the house. He was always restless. Twitchy. I thought he was just odd. Odd, yes, but not foolish, she replied. Tell me, did he wear gloves? Kerridge blinked. Yes. Now that you mention it, always. Even when it was warm. Back at Hawthorne Grange, Theodora returned to the drawing room, where Mrs. Dalrymple was rearranging orchids in a cut glass vase. The air smelled faintly of cloves and pipe smoke. A clock ticked gently on the mantel. Mrs. Dalrymple greeted her with a smile too measured to be warm. I hope you've found what you came for, she said, eyes flicking briefly to the window. I'm getting there, Theodora replied. Tell me, madam, how long had you known Mr. Kerridge before inviting him to stay? Oh, not long. We'd corresponded about the orchids. He was highly recommended by the Royal Botanical Society. And yet, you didn't mention that to the inspector earlier. The older woman's smile wavered. I didn't think it relevant. On the contrary, Theodora said gently, I believe it's very relevant. She stepped to the fireplace, where a pair of gardening gloves rested on a small side table. She picked one up, turning it inside out. Traces of rust lingered in the stitching. Welding residue, she murmured. Mrs. Dalrymple stood rigid. Surely not mine. No, said Theodora, but someone's. And someone who had access to this room. Pettigrew, who had entered quietly behind her, cleared his throat. We've just received word from London. Baylis's fingerprints do not match those found on the lever mechanism. In fact, his confession is beginning to fall apart under questioning. Theodora held up the glove. This isn't just about theft. It's about misdirection. Baylis may have played a part, but someone here planned the performance. She turned back to Mrs. Dalrymple. Tell me, when was the last time you saw your nephew? There was silence. Then, what nephew? John Dalrymple. Former apprentice metal worker. Disappeared from your employ last year after a minor scandal. If the vicar's gossip is to be believed. Something about a quarrel over money. No charges filed, but he left quietly. Mrs. Dalrymple's lips thinned. That has nothing to do with this. I think it does, Theodora said. Because he's been seen in the next village, under a different name. And the welding on the trapdoor. Professional. Recent. He helped stage this. Didn't he? Kerridge was lured, struck and hidden. Baylis was to be the fall. And you the grieving hostess. Pettigrew stepped forward, soft but firm. Where is he, madam? There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Dalrymple sighed deeply, like a balloon deflating. In the potting shed, she whispered. He said it was only temporary. A way to frighten Walter into giving up the orchid. He swore no one would be hurt. Theodora tilted her head. You believed him? I wanted to. He's my brother's son. Within the hour, John Dalrymple was pulled from the potting shed, where he had been hiding for days, waiting for news of Baylis's arrest. His expression as they took him in was not guilt, but frustration, as if the world had cheated him of a perfect scheme. Later, as the sun sank behind the hedgerows, Theodora walked once more through the garden, her umbrella tapping gently against the stones. Pettigrew followed, hands in pockets. You were right, he said. It wasn't over. It rarely is, she replied. A confession too easily given is often one borrowed. Pettigrew watched her go, the tall figure drifting down the garden path between ivy and dusk. For a brief moment, he thought the footsteps might vanish too, but they didn't. They only led to the next question. The next morning brought rain, soft and unrelenting, cloaking the garden in mist and muffling footsteps into silence. Theodora Vane stood beneath the vine-covered trellis, watching rivulets trace down the marble cheeks of the cherub, as though the statue itself wept at the secrets uncovered. The confession of Mrs. Dalrymple and the arrest of her nephew should have marked the end. Yet Theodora's expression remained pensive. Inspector Pettigrew, damp from his walk, joined her with a steaming cup of tea in hand. The nephew's in custody. Baylis too, though his charge may well be reduced to accessory. I should feel satisfaction, he muttered. But I don't. Because it isn't finished, Theodora said, accepting the cup. There's something deeper here. People are speaking too freely, or not at all. It's rarely the silence that lies, more often the fluency. They began their questioning that day not with suspects, but with the bystanders, the villagers who had been closest to the scene, those who had seen something or claimed they had. Mrs. Tilling, still breathless with excitement despite the time that had passed, repeated her story with theatrical clarity. He was lying there, she insisted, pointing to the clearing near the hazel tree. Face down, or maybe curled a bit. I only saw him a second. Then I turned to shout, and when I looked again, gone, like the devil himself had lifted him. You're sure it was a man? Theodora asked. Of course, tall, broad at the shoulders. Didn't move a muscle. And the time? A little after 11. I remember because the church bells had just struck. Theodora made no comment, but something in her gaze turned sharp. When Mrs. Tilling departed with a proud flourish, Pettigrew leaned in. You doubt her? She's describing a mannequin, Theodora replied softly. Or a staged silhouette. No man struck on the head and dragged underground would appear broad at the shoulders and still as stone. He would twitch, moan. There would be signs of distress. She didn't see a man, she saw a planted image. They turned next to the housekeeper, Mrs. Betts, a narrow-eyed woman who had been with Mrs. Dalrymple for nearly 20 years and clearly saw no reason to begin trusting strangers now. She offered stiff answers, avoiding eye contact, her lips pressed thin as pressed linen. I keep to the kitchen, she said. Didn't even know the man was missing until you lot started poking around. And I certainly didn't see anyone skulking through the shrubbery. Did you know John Dalrymple had returned? Theodora asked. The woman hesitated, barely perceptibly. I hadn't seen him, if that's what you mean. But had you heard him, Mrs. Betts's hands twitched as she rearranged the sugar tin. The house creaks in the wind. Doesn't mean there's a ghost. Theodora exchanged a glance with Pettigrew. It wasn't a denial. You were loyal to her, Theodora said carefully. You still are. But what she asked of you protecting him wasn't fair? I didn't protect him, Mrs. Betts said quietly. I protected her. With that, she stood and left the room. Next came Reverend Lyle, summoned politely for a pastoral conversation. He arrived soaked and apologetic, all spectacles and stammering pleasantries. Yet his account introduced a subtle dissonance. "You see," he said, sipping tea and staring into the middle distance, "Walter Kerridge came to me just 2 days before the incident. He was uneasy. Mentioned, well, not quite threats, but the feeling of being watched. He thought perhaps someone was after his work. I advised him to speak to Mrs. Dalrymple." "Did he say who he feared?" Theodora asked. "No names. Only that something in the garden wasn't as it seemed." When they asked if Kerridge had enemies in the village, the vicar hesitated. "Not enemies, no. But I did notice, Miss Chudley, the chemist's sister, seemed very interested in him. Too interested, perhaps, and he avoided her." That afternoon, Theodora called on Miss Harriet Chudley, a woman of a certain age with an unexpectedly girlish voice and a passion for pressed flowers. She welcomed them eagerly, offering them almond biscuits before launching into her recollections. "I told Walter," she said brightly, "that he should have someone watch his back. Not everyone's pleased about the orchid, you know. There are collectors, dangerous ones, who'd do anything to get their hands on something that rare. Did Walter tell you that?" No, but I read it. In Botanical Curiosities of the Empire. Lovely book. All about thefts and poisonings and such." Theodora smiled politely. "And how did you know about the orchid?" "It was only recently confirmed." Harriet blinked. "Oh, Walter told me, of course. Later, when Pettigrew checked Kerridge's journal, he found the mention. Do not tell anyone about the sanguinis, not even Harriet." "She knew without being told," Theodora murmured. "Which means she either found the sketchbook or someone showed it to her." At dusk, Walter Kerridge himself was brought to the drawing room again. His recovery had been steady, but now, as Theodora watched him, something else struck her. Not the bruises or the bandage, but the man's posture. Alert, observant, waiting to be questioned but offering nothing unless prompted. She leaned forward. "Walter, you've been remarkably cooperative, and yet oddly guarded." He frowned slightly. "I was attacked, hidden in a hole. I think I'm allowed to be cautious." "Of course," she said gently. "But tell me, did you recognize your attacker's voice?" He hesitated. "It sounded like Baylis, I assumed, but was it?" she asked. "Was it exactly him, or merely similar?" "I can't be sure." "You can," she said softly. "You're a botanical illustrator. You notice detail. Shadows, texture, line. You can't pretend now to be vague." Kerridge's eyes flicked to the window. "Why does it matter?" Baylis confessed. Theodora rose. "Because the truth rarely arrives wearing someone else's coat. I believe Baylis was manipulated. John Dalrymple was involved. But I don't believe either one staged the full performance. I think someone rehearsed the parts, handed out the costumes, and stayed out of sight." Walter said nothing. As Theodora stepped into the hallway, Pettigrew caught up with her. "You suspect him?" "Not fully," she said. "But I suspect someone used him. Perhaps more than one someone." She paused beside the coat rack, eyeing a dark green scarf draped carelessly over the side. "That wasn't there before," she said quietly. Pettigrew raised an eyebrow. "You think someone's come back?" "No," Theodora replied, fingering the scarf's edge. "I think someone never left. Outside." The rain had stopped. The garden glistened under moonlight, serene and deceptive as ever. Theodora Vane stood at its edge, scanning the shadows. "Voices lie," she said softly. "But footsteps, even vanishing ones, leave their rhythm behind. and she stepped once more into the garden to listen. Moonlight threw sharp silver angles across the hedgerows as Theodora Vane paced the gravel path, her fingers brushing the damp leaves like a pianist skimming unfamiliar keys. Somewhere in the garden's symmetry lay the disorder she sought, an overlooked thread or motive that had not yet aligned with the others. Too many people with too much to lose, and no single story that held steady under scrutiny. She needed to untangle not just the facts, but the intent. Back in the drawing room, Inspector Pettigrew laid out their findings on paper. Dates, names, statements, and the still murky timeline. Baylis's confession had faltered under pressure, reduced now to an admission of theft and an unwitting role in the broader deception. John Dalrymple's involvement had been proven. He'd done the welding, helped stage the tunnel abduction. But even he claimed surprise at the turn the plan had taken. That left the question who had orchestrated it all. Theodora tapped a pencil against her lip, staring at a name underlined thrice: Walter Kerridge. His bruises were real, his fear too. But his evasions weren't the result of trauma alone. She returned to his journal, where an early entry caught her attention. Dalrymple knows about the orchid. I never told him. I don't know how he found out. Someone told him, she murmured. Someone in this house. Harriet Chudley had claimed knowledge of the orchid's rarity. Knowledge she should never have possessed, unless Kerridge had confided in her. But his journal clearly ruled that out. She may have learned it another way, through someone who'd already seen the sketches, or heard of them. Someone close enough to Kerridge to exploit his work. She recalled the housekeeper's remark, "I protected her." Theodora's thoughts circled again to Mrs. Dalrymple, not just her protection of John, but her relationship to Kerridge. She'd invited him to stay, had supported his research, had funded it, in fact, through a rare grant of her own. Yet now she was silent, passive, too passive. Theodora returned to the study and found Mrs. Dalrymple seated at her escritoire, pretending to read. The silence stretched long before Theodora finally spoke. "Why him?" The older woman looked up. "I beg your pardon. Walter Kerridge. Of all the botanical illustrators, why did you choose him? You could have brought in a name, a scholar. But you chose a man with no reputation and a history of debt." A flicker crossed her face. He needed the work. But did you need him? She shut the book with a snap. "Are you accusing me of something again, Miss Vane?" Theodora's voice remained calm. "I'm asking whether this was ever about the orchid." Mrs. Dalrymple rose, paced to the window. "He reminded me of my husband. Idealistic. Never. I thought I could help him. Perhaps I overstepped. Or perhaps you became possessive." The words hung, and Mrs. Dalrymple turned. "You think I planned this?" "I think you allowed it," Theodora said gently. "I think someone told John about the orchid. Someone close. And I think the plan wasn't just to frighten Walter Kerridge. It was to destroy him." "Why?" she whispered. "Because you couldn't keep him." Mrs. Dalrymple's voice cracked. "He was leaving. He had an offer from the Royal Gardens. He was going to publish under his own name. I wasn't part of that world. He said thank you and goodbye as if I'd been a footnote in his story." "You funded him?" Theodora said. "Sheltered him. Believed he owed you something more. I told John to scare him. That's all. Just long enough to make him stay. I never meant." Her voice broke again. "But then Baylis showed up, asking questions, and John got ideas. It made sense now. John's involvement was tactical, opportunistic. Baylis was the perfect fall. The local eccentric, the convenient villain. John and his aunt had built the stage together. He, the practical hand, she, the emotional push. But somewhere, the plan had outgrown them. Someone else had stepped in. Theodora's thoughts returned again to Harriet Chudley. She visited her unannounced the next morning. Harriet answered in her dressing gown, flustered but not surprised. "You have a keen interest in rare things," Theodora said, "and a knack for learning things you shouldn't." "I read," Harriet said primly. "But you also eavesdrop." Harriet's mouth flattened. "I think you overheard Walter speaking with Mrs. Dalrymple. You learned about the orchid. And you knew what it was worth. What are you suggesting? That you approached Baylis, encouraged his obsession, fed him just enough information that he'd come sniffing?" Harriet's eyes blazed. "You think I needed money?" "No," Theodora said. "I think you wanted revenge." Harriet's silence was answer enough. "Walter Kerridge spurned you. That much is obvious. And you resented it. But more than that, you resented how everyone saw you, as harmless, as decorative. So you whispered in the right ears. Set wheels in motion." Harriet's voice was brittle. "He made a fool of me." "You made one of him in return," Theodora said. "And you nearly destroyed his life." When they confronted her with witness testimony, Baylis admitting she had shared odd details about the orchid, the vicar recalling her lurking near the garden wall at curious hours, Harriet broke, not with tears but with something quieter, a bitter sort of pride. "I never touched him," she said. "I only opened the door." Pettigrew later said it was like solving 3 cases at once. Dalrymple and his aunt had plotted the abduction. Harriet had fed the flame of suspicion into Baylis's hands. Baylis himself, a lonely figure who longed to be significant, had taken the bait. And through it all, Kerridge had remained unaware, until the moment the trap closed. Theodora sat with him on the final evening, beneath the same trellis where the first lie had taken root. "I should have seen it," he said softly. How quickly admiration turns to something else. "You saw only your work," she said. "Some of us live too close to the petals to notice the thorns." He looked at her. "And you?" "I listened to the roots," she replied. The garden no longer seemed so peaceful, but the footsteps, though vanishing, had led her to the truth. Inspector Pettigrew's announcement was made with a sort of triumphant finality that echoed through the halls of the Dalrymple estate like a gavel striking wood. Harriet Chudley had signed a statement admitting to feeding deliberate misinformation to Mr. Baylis. Baylis, under pressure and starved of allies, had crumbled completely. His confessions came in disordered fragments, weaving an elaborate if clumsy narrative of jealousy, theft, and a misguided quest for justice. Mrs. Dalrymple, with tears and quiet dignity, admitted to funding Kerridge's stay and enlisting her nephew's help to delay his departure, insisting she never meant to cause harm. And John, sullen, defensive, offered nothing beyond weary acknowledgement. The picture appeared complete. Pettigrew prepared his report for the Home Office. But Theodora Vane stood by the cold hearth in the study, her arms folded, her gaze fixed on the empty grate, as though watching something smolder within it. The house had grown quiet again. The scent of early frost drifted in through a cracked casement, mingling with dust and fading flowers. On paper, the case was closed. The responsible parties were named, their roles assigned, and the unpleasantness soon to be filed and forgotten. Yet something resisted conclusion. It wasn't simply a matter of intuition, though Theodora trusted hers implicitly. It was the dissonance. The unresolved threads that tugged at the edges of the supposed solution like loose stitching on a carefully tailored garment. The staging of the garden scene, the absence of Kerridge's footsteps, the depth of Baylis's supposed insight, it was all too tidy, too precise. Baylis had never once demonstrated the cunning required for such orchestration. Nor had John, for all his surliness, shown the control needed to execute a psychological charade. And then there was the matter of the orchid sketch. The one found burnt behind the greenhouse, ashes still warm when discovered days before. Kerridge swore he had never drawn it, yet the style was unmistakably his. It had been used, presumably, to inflame Baylis's belief in a conspiracy. But who had forged it, and why? She returned to the ash heap that afternoon, knelt, and ran a gloved finger along the scorched rim of the garden trough. Nearby, the gardener's shed stood locked. She retrieved the key from the housekeeper and stepped inside. Dust lay thick over the tools. A workbench held drying seed trays and a battered tin box filled with matchsticks, graphite shavings and charred paper edges. Not ordinary gardening refuse. She drew out one of the matchsticks and examined the head. Coated in a substance she recognized at once gum arabic, the sort used in botanical illustration to affix pigment. Someone had used this shed not only for gardening but for art. In the corner sat a battered case, half obscured by a draped tarp. Opening it revealed a travel-sized watercolor kit, dried reds, blues, and greens. A single sable brush still damp at the bristles. She held it to her nose, orchid red. When she emerged, Inspector Pettigrew was speaking with a journalist from the Hampshire Courier, giving a statement about the swift resolution of the Baylis case. Kerridge stood nearby, his expression unreadable as the reporter scribbled down Pettigrew's confident summation. "Miss Vane," the inspector called as she approached. "Perhaps you'll offer a quote as well. About the ingenuity of our friends here." "I'll offer something else," she replied coolly. A question. She turned to Kerridge. "Are you left-handed?" He blinked yes. "Why?" She turned to the inspector. "Then perhaps you'll explain why the forged sketch we found bears brushstrokes consistent with a right-handed artist." Pettigrew's mouth opened, then closed. The reporter glanced between them, intrigued. "I found a brush today," she continued, "still tacky with pigment, and matchsticks coated with gum. Whoever forged the sketch did so recently, and not with the finesse of Mr. Kerridge. The angle of the strokes, the pressure marks, they all point to someone forcing a mimicry. The real artist was someone who needed that sketch to be found. Harriet. It was possible, but her confession had been laced with personal venom, not strategy. "What if?" Theodora said slowly. "The sketch wasn't just a device to manipulate Baylis. What if it was bait?" Pettigrew frowned. "Bait for whom?" "For you," she said simply. The words landed like a gust in still air. The inspector straightened, visibly unsettled. The false narrative, the convenient resolution, it all led to a tidy conclusion that let someone else slip away unnoticed. A person clever enough to stay behind the curtain while others performed. Kerridge looked up, pale. Who would go to such lengths? Theodora hesitated, then said, "Someone who had access to all of you. Someone you never suspected. Someone with time, motive, and skill." A creak on the gravel walk interrupted them. The vicar was approaching. Reverend Aubrey Pilbeam, with his ever-present walking stick and genial frown. He raised a hand. "Forgive me. I was told you were in the garden. I've just had a rather troubling thought about Sunday's schedule and—" He trailed off as he noticed their expressions. Theodora's gaze sharpened. "Reverend, you spent much time here over the summer, didn't you?" "Indeed. I often took tea with Mrs. Dalrymple." "And did you know about the orchid?" "Only what Walter told me." He glanced at Kerridge. He was rather proud of his discovery. "Did he show you the sketch?" Pilbeam hesitated. "No, I don't believe so." But you recognized it immediately when you saw it, didn't you? There was the faintest flicker of movement in his cheek. I may have seen something similar. I believe you traced it, Theodora said. Copied it, poorly, and burnt it to stage a discovery. But not for Harriet or Baylis or even Mrs. Dalrymple. You wanted everyone looking away from you. The walking stick tapped the path once, twice, then stopped. You're quite mistaken, Miss Vane, he said softly. She stepped closer. Am I? You were the only one with both access and neutrality. Everyone spoke freely around you. You knew of Harriet's resentment, John's schemes, Mrs. Dalrymple's indulgence. You used those tensions, fed them. And when it all threatened to explode, you offered the authorities a path of least resistance, a tidy tale with just enough truth to satisfy. He said nothing. Pettigrew moved slowly behind him, hand brushing the baton at his hip. You forged the sketch, Theodora said. You fanned Baylis's delusion. You set the stage for a crime that never happened, so that when the real damage was done, no one would think to look at the man who merely led the prayers. Reverend Pilbeam sighed. Not prayers, he said at last. Only absolution. And sometimes that takes a cleverer lie. The stick dropped from his hand as Pettigrew closed the distance, and this time, the footsteps in the garden did not vanish. They led to a man who had walked quietly among them all, writing the story even as he preached its moral. And somewhere in the grass, a brush lay drying in the cold air. The vicar's confession was not a confession in the traditional sense. There were no grand proclamations, no wringing of hands. Instead, Reverend Pilbeam had spoken in riddles, cloaked in scripture and resignation. His words shaded with a peculiar sadness. He was taken into custody that evening, quiet as a leaf falling from a bough. And yet, even as Inspector Pettigrew shook off the lingering tension with a brandy, and prepared his final notes for London, Theodora Vane stood once more in the garden, not to save a victory, but to face the sensation she hated most in completeness. The cold had deepened. Frost kissed the edges of every petal and stone. Moonlight spread in thin veils across the lawn. Something still felt wrong, not about the vicar's guilt, which seemed evident enough, but the shape of the entire affair. It had moved too smoothly. And more unsettling, the true motive behind Pilbeam's actions remained clouded. Why go to such lengths? Why now? It was Kerridge who gave her the missing thread. He found her the next morning in the library, reading the parish register. He looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held out a folded piece of parchment. "You should see this," he said. "It's from the vicar's study. I only noticed it after the constables sealed the vestry." Theodora unfolded the page. It was brittle and yellowed with age, a fragment torn from a church newsletter nearly 20 years old. The headline read Choirboy's Death-Ruled Tragic Misadventure. Beneath it, a grainy photograph of a younger Pilbeam standing beside a stone baptismal font. His face wore the same calm expression he always did, but it was the name of the boy that caught her breath. Gregory Dalrymple. She looked up slowly. Mrs. Dalrymple's son. Kerridge nodded. Her only child. Theodora read the article in silence. Gregory had been 13. Drowned in the church while during choir practice, late autumn 1905. No witnesses. The boy had often wandered off, the article said, slippery footing. A terrible accident. The vicar had conducted the funeral himself. The case had closed quietly. But now, the air felt colder than it had in the garden. "She never speaks of him," Kerridge murmured. "I've been here all summer, and not once. I just thought she had no children." "She does," Theodora replied, folding the parchment again. "Or did. And Pilbeam was there when it happened." The realization struck her like lightning, Not just the event itself, but what it suggested. Pilbeam had stayed close to the Dalrymples ever since. As a family friend, yes, but perhaps something more. A penitent. A watcher. A man bound to a wound no one else could see. She turned back to the parish book. It contained all the old confirmations, marriages, and baptisms, a meticulous record. She flipped through the years, tracing names. Chudley, Baylis, even Harriet's parents appeared once, long before they moved away. She paused at an entry from 1900's George Kerridge, gardener's son, baptized Easter Sunday. But something else, 2 names listed together 5 years later, caught her eye. Gregory Dalrymple, Marcus Baylis. Confirmed St. Jude's Parish Choir. Theodora's brow furrowed. They were friends. Baylis never mentioned him, Kerridge said quietly. Of course not, she murmured. Why would he? She closed the book, stood, and crossed to the window, her thoughts moving in swift, silent corridors. Gregory, Marcus, and Pilbeam. A triangle stretching back decades. And then the drowning. A death that seemed senseless, unless one looked harder. Suppose the tragedy wasn't an accident. Suppose someone knew something, Baylis, perhaps, as a boy. And perhaps the guilt, or the silence, grew with time. What if Pilbeam had spent all these years suppressing the past, only for Baylis to return and begin speaking too loudly again? Suddenly, the motive sharpened. He wasn't just protecting the present, she said aloud. He was covering the past. Kerridge looked up. You think Baylis remembered, maybe not at first, but something brought it back. A word, a hymn, a face. It stirred something. Perhaps he started asking questions. Too many, loudly. And Pilbeam, who had survived this long with his secrets intact, couldn't afford a reckoning. Kerridge paled. So he staged the whole crime to silence him again.
Yes,
Theodora said. And to ensure the blame scattered like petals in the wind. But it wasn't just self-preservation. I think it was punishment. For who? For everyone. She moved through the corridor with renewed urgency, returning to the study. The police had removed most of Pilbeam's belongings, but a few forgotten items remained. Books mostly, and one strange artifact tucked between hymnals. A pocket-sized wooden puzzle box. It slid open with a click. Inside were folded photographs, sepia and soft at the edges. One showed young Gregory, arms slung around Marcus Baylis, both in choir robes. Another showed the vicar beside Mrs. Dalrymple, years younger, gazing at the grave of a child. A scrap of paper fluttered loose, covered in ink scrawl. The past does not forget, it only waits for silence. She read it twice, then again. It wasn't madness, she said softly. It was mourning. Weaponized mourning. She looked at Kerridge. Wellworth thought Pilbeam was manipulating the present. But he was drawing a circle back to where it began. He made the others part of his elegy. A final act of control over grief. Outside, a robin sang low and short in the hedge. The frost had begun to melt. Later that evening, after Pettigrew had been properly shaken and redirected, and the Home Office had agreed to reopen Gregory's file, Theodora lingered on the garden path where it all began. The footsteps had vanished because Pilbeam never walked the path that night. He never needed to. He'd placed Baylis there like a discarded relic, a symbol of a past that refused to remain buried. The misdirection, the false crime, the manipulated sketches, it had all been a burial rite. But unlike before, this time the grave refused to stay closed. As the last of the sun disappeared behind the chapel stones, Theodora stood very still. There were more shadows to untangle, and some roots, once uncovered, never stopped growing. The village had settled into a brittle stillness, the kind that comes not with peace, but with the exhaustion of revelation. Reverend Pilbeam's arrest had rocked the parish to its roots. Yet the murmurs that rippled through tea shops and hedgerows spoke not of closure, but of confusion. Something about the whole affair still gnawed at the edge of sense. An itch behind the eye that no one could quite reach. Theodora Vane knew it best. The more tightly the official narrative was wrapped, the more she noticed its frayed seams. She returned to the Dalrymple house that morning not out of curiosity, but necessity. There was one aspect of the affair that had gone woefully untouched. Mrs. Dalrymple herself. She had hovered at the edges throughout, ethereal and calm, neither defensive nor grieving, merely present. And yet, Theodora could not reconcile her quiet acceptance with the storm that had broken around her. She had lost a son long ago, a lodger more recently, and now her trusted vicar. Still, she floated through it like mist through trees. Mrs. Dalrymple answered the door in her usual grey silk, her eyes alert and dry. "You're back," she said. "I need to ask you a favor," Theodora replied. "Something unconventional." They sat in the drawing room, where everything had the polished cold of a stage set. Theodora produced a sheaf of paper from her satchel, pages of old hymnals, sheet music, and choir rosters from St. Jude's archives. "I want you to help me remember," she said. "Not facts. Atmosphere, the choir, the children, the rehearsals. What it sounded like. What it felt like." Mrs. Dalrymple blinked once. "You think memory will solve this?" "I think truth sometimes lives in tone, not text." A faint smile tugged at the older woman's mouth. "Very well, Miss Vane. Let us chase ghosts with music." For the next hour, Theodora played fragments on the house's upright piano, haltingly, not for beauty but recognition. Simple hymns, mostly "Abide with Me," "O Sacred Head Surrounded," and one unusual piece tucked among the rest. A lesser-known hymn by a 19th-century composer called "The Unseen Footsteps." At its second verse, Mrs. Dalrymple startled. "That one," she murmured. "He used to hum that. Your son?" "No," she said slowly. "Baylis. When he came to dinner." Just under his breath, like it was stuck in his throat. Theodora's fingers froze on the keys. That hymn had been chosen specifically for the funeral service Pilbeam had arranged. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, it fit the setting. But now, it felt like an echo carefully planted. She rose suddenly. "Thank you. That's exactly what I needed." Outside, the morning wind rattled through the hedges. Kerridge waited on the path, his face pale with curiosity. "What now?" he asked. "A trick," she said. She returned to the police outpost at the vicarage and requested one final conversation with the arrested man. Pettigrew, though irked, obliged reluctantly. "He's already confessed, Miss Vane." "Then let's make sure he meant it." They sat again in the vestry, though the room felt emptier now. Pilbeam had the look of a man past earthly concerns, but his eyes flickered to life as Theodora laid the sheet music before him. "I found the hymn," she said. "The one you used at Baylis's funeral. And the one from Gregory's, if I'm not mistaken." His face didn't change, but his hands twitched. "I played it this morning for Mrs. Dalrymple. She remembers Baylis humming it." "So do I, come to think of it. Odd habit, wouldn't you say?" Silence. Theodora leaned forward. "It's not the kind of hymn a man hums unless it means something." Pilbeam blinked slowly. "I think he knew," she said. "About Gregory. About what really happened. I think he remembered more than he let on. And I think that frightened you." "I was frightened of a great many things," Pilbeam said quietly. "Were you frightened of Mrs. Dalrymple?" That struck deeper than she expected. A shadow crossed his face. "I owed her," he said. "I owed them both. But debts don't always stay quiet, do they?" Pilbeam looked away. Theodora pressed. "Tell me. Did Marcus Baylis blackmail you? The vicar didn't answer, but his hand moved unconsciously across the table and rested atop the hymn. His fingers drummed it once, twice, a familiar rhythm. It was the melody. Theodora stood. That night, she staged the final experiment. She invited the remaining villagers, Mrs. Dalrymple, Kerridge, even the organist Mr. Endicott, to a quiet memorial in the church. A private service for peace, she said. But it wasn't peace she was after. It was reaction. The organist played the unseen footsteps as the opening hymn. As it began, she watched the pews. And there it was. Mrs. Dalrymple, serene as ever, blinked slowly at the first verse, then closed her eyes, not in grief, in tension. She was gripping the kneeler in front of her. Her knuckles were white. Later, Theodora found her in the vestry corridor. You knew, Mrs. Dalrymple turned. About Gregory. You knew Baylis had something to do with it. Perhaps not the full picture, but enough. You let Pilbeam stay close all these years. You accepted his penance, his dinners, his pastoral concern. You let him rot from the inside, and when he offered to deal with Baylis, you didn't stop him. Mrs. Dalrymple looked at her calmly. I forgave him long ago, she said. But I never promised to save him from himself. Why the hymn? Theodora asked. She smiled faintly. Because guilt hums. And Marcus was always humming. The door opened behind them. Kerridge stood, eyes wide. So she knew everything. He whispered. Not everything, Theodora said. But enough. She turned to Mrs. Dalrymple. And now? Now, said the older woman. I will forget again. Theodora doubted it, but she said nothing. As they left the vestry, Theodora caught one final detail, scratched faintly into the back of the wooden pulpit. The initials GD, next to a crude drawing of a foot. Not seen, but always there. She ran her fingers over it, then let go. The rain came back that night, soft and steady, soaking the stonework of St. Jude's and flattening the gardens into slick mud and dying petals. Theodora sat in her rooms above the bookseller's shop. The sheets of notes she'd compiled spread across the floor like an unfinished puzzle. The hymn, the scratchings in the pulpit, the drawn-out threads of guilt and silence all pointed in the same direction, and for the first time in days, a shape had begun to form. But before she could set it fully in place, it slipped again, like something unseen tugging at the corners. Just before midnight, Kerridge banged on her door, dripping and breathless. You'd better come. The vestry's been broken into. Theodora grabbed her coat and followed him out into the dark. The church stood silent but ajar, the side door swung open on its hinge. Inside, the vestry was a ruin. Drawers flung open, files scattered across the floor, and in the corner, the narrow wooden cabinet that held Pilbeam's personal effects. The handwritten funeral plans, the annotated sermons, the music sheets, was wide open and empty. Everything's gone, Kerridge said grimly. Theodora stepped in slowly, trying not to disturb the mess. Who had a key to this cabinet? Pilbeam, the sexton, and the bishop's office, he replied. But this doesn't look like a careful search. No. It looked rushed, panicked. Whoever came hadn't been looking for everything, just something. She moved to the pulpit, where she'd seen the faint initials and the carved foot the night before. She knelt and ran her hand along the base. Gone. The carving had been sanded down. Messily, the edges of the wood still rough to the touch. Someone's cleaning up, she murmured. Someone who knows exactly where the cracks are. But what would they want with an old sermon or a childish doodle? Kerridge asked. Theodora didn't answer immediately. She bent to the floor, examining the scattered pages. A torn corner of something handwritten lay half beneath the overturned hymnal stack. She fished it out and squinted. It was Pilbeam's handwriting. A note, dated 2 months ago. Baylis becoming erratic. Avoids confession. Pressing too close to Gregory's memory. Will not stop humming that infernal hymn. Must speak to Margaret. The rest was missing, torn away. Margaret, she whispered. Mrs. Dalrymple. Do you think she's part of it? Theodora said. But she wouldn't break in here herself. No. Someone else is sweeping the board. She tucked the scrap into her coat pocket. We need to talk to the bishop. By morning. Word of the break-in had travelled fast. The Bishop of Ely, long skeptical of the whole village drama, received them stiffly in his office, but when Theodora laid the scrap of Pilbeam's note before him, his expression darkened. I'll speak plainly, he said. Pilbeam wrote me last month. A brief letter. He feared repercussions. Said he was sitting on old secrets, and that if anything happened to him, I should secure the vestry. I dismissed it as nerves. Who else knew of the letter? She asked. No one. Who could know? The bishop hesitated. It would have passed through my secretary. Or perhaps one of the diocesan aides. But even so, this? He gestured at the note. This was internal. Personal. Theodora pressed. Was Mrs. Dalrymple in contact with the diocese? A pause. She wrote once a year, the bishop said slowly. A single donation in her husband's name. That's all. And recently. 2 months ago. Accompanied by a note thanking us for protecting the quiet dignity of the church's memory. She exchanged a glance with Kerridge. Back in Marston Clay, a faint unease had begun to ripple through the remaining suspects. The funeral director, the organist, even the milkman seemed to keep their heads low and their words brief. It wasn't just gossip anymore, it was dread. Someone had taken the initiative to destroy evidence, and that someone hadn't stopped with the church. Theodora returned to the Dalrymple house late in the afternoon, unannounced. Mrs. Dalrymple answered the door without surprise. I wondered how long it would take, she said. I assume you've heard. I assume you think I'm responsible. Are you? A beat. No, she said. But I know who might be. They sat again in the quiet drawing room, the same room where so many threads had begun to tighten. There's someone you haven't met, Mrs. Dalrymple said. My niece, Lillian, lives in Cambridge now. She used to visit in the summers years ago. She and Gregory were close. Too close, some whispered. After his death, she never returned. But recently, she wrote, asked about the church. About the old choir. About Marcus. Why didn't you mention her before? I didn't think it mattered. Now it mattered very much. Theodora arranged to visit Lillian the following morning. A crisp, modern flat in Cambridge's student quarter. Lillian Dalrymple was pale, composed, and guarded. Yes, I heard what happened, she said as they sat. Though I wasn't aware I'd become part of the inquiry. You haven't? Not yet, Theodora said. But you wrote to your aunt, asked about events from 20 years ago. I was curious. Curiosity strong enough to travel back to Marston Clay. She hesitated. I didn't. Not even to visit the church you used to sing in. A flicker. Barely visible. I was in Ely for a few days, Lillian admitted. Academic work. Did your work involve breaking locks? Now the smile broke, brittle and sharp. What are you implying? Miss Vane. That someone is removing pieces from the board, Theodora said. And they're doing it now, not 20 years ago. That's not old guilt. That's present fear. Lillian stood. You should leave. I will. But you should know whatever you're trying to hide, it won't hold. Not now. Someone already died for it. As Theodora stepped outside, The rain had started again, fine and cold. The stolen papers, the scrubbed carving, the missing music, all of it pointed not to the past, but to a present hand working desperately to erase the past before the final pattern emerged. She walked back to the train station slowly, the case unraveling and reforming in her head. The footsteps in the garden may have vanished, but someone was still walking their path, in silence and in fear, and they were getting closer. Theodora arrived back in Marston Clay just after nightfall, the cold wind sweeping over the village with an urgency that seemed to echo her own unease. The station was nearly deserted, save for the stationmaster leaning in his usual post against the wall, pipe dangling from his lips, and a wiry terrier asleep at his feet. She walked briskly through the lanes, passing the darkened butcher's and the post office, until the spire of St. Jude's loomed above the rooftops, a stark silhouette against the silvered sky. Kerridge was waiting at the bookshop with a grim expression that told her before he spoke. Something had gone terribly wrong. "There's been another incident," he said quietly. "You'd best come." She followed him without a word. It wasn't the church this time, nor the Dalrymple house. It was the vicarage. They found Rev. Kerr slumped over his writing desk, blood seeping from the base of his skull, staining the carpet below like ink from a shattered bottle. The blow had come from behind, swift and silent. A heavy paperweight lay on the floor beside him, smeared with red. The study had been disturbed, but not ransacked. This wasn't a burglary. It was a warning. The constable on duty muttered about robbery gone wrong, but Theodora shook her head. Nothing's been taken, except silence. Kerr knew something. She scanned the desk. A sermon draft, half finished. A stack of funeral notices, and beneath a blotter, just visible, an envelope addressed to Miss Vane Scow Kerridge, Marston Clay. She pried it free. The envelope had been opened and resealed hastily, likely by the killer. Inside was a single sheet, penned in the same careful hand Kerr used for parish notices. "My conscience has stirred, and I cannot hold it longer. There is more to Gregory Baylis's disappearance than I admitted. Margaret swore me to secrecy long ago, but I fear we have nursed a viper in our bosom. I will speak with you in person tomorrow at midday." Tomorrow would never come. Theodora pocketed the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. The investigation was no longer merely retrospective. Someone in the village, someone who had waited 2 decades to act, had now killed again. The past had returned not as a ghost, but as a blade. Outside the vicarage, a drizzle had begun to fall again, soft and cold. Kerridge looked stricken. He was a good man. Timid, yes, and easily steered, but decent. Who would? Someone desperate, she said. Desperate enough to risk everything to keep a secret buried. They walked back through the streets in silence, the windows of the houses like watchful eyes. Somewhere behind one of those panes, the killer moved, quietly, methodically, watching. She returned to her rooms and sat in the dark for a long time, replaying everything. The first death, the erased carving, the torn note, the secret niece. Each piece had suggested a slow, concealed conspiracy, but now it had teeth. And it wasn't done. She pulled out her notes, adding a name underlined in red: Lillian Dalrymple. Her visit to Cambridge had revealed more than Lillian realized. The evasions, the flicker of alarm, there was something in her silence that had shifted the balance of the case. But could she have returned to Marston Clay so quickly? Could she have crept into the vicarage unnoticed? Theodora made a decision. Before dawn she took the first train back to Cambridge. But Lillian was gone. Her flatmate, an indifferent young woman with purple hair and a disdainful stare, told Theodora she'd packed a bag the night before and left. No note. No message. She said she had something to settle, the flatmate added, almost as an afterthought. By the time Theodora returned to the village, the storm had gathered properly. Wind clawed at the trees and gutters overflowed. The church bell untended tolled once in the gale. The village was shrinking into itself, fearful and whispering. No one opened their doors. Even Mrs. Dalrymple had gone silent. Kerridge met her by the gate. "No one's seen her," he said simply. "Then she's either hiding or running," Theodora replied. "And either one means we're closer than ever." They split up. Kerridge heading toward the rectory, while she circled around the east side of the churchyard, where the garden lay half flooded, and the old greenhouse stood like a glass skeleton against the hedge. There, in the half-light, she saw a figure crouched near the broken stone path. She stepped closer. It was the organist, Mr. Creech, mud on his shoes, his coat soaked through, his face pale. He looked up, startled, then ashamed. "I thought I saw someone coming in here," he said. "A girl. But I must have been mistaken." Theodora narrowed her eyes. "Why would she come here?" He hesitated. "Because it's where it started. This place, it has roots, Miss Vane, roots." She turned her gaze to the garden, where the first crime had begun. The garden where the footsteps vanished. Then she saw it. A flash of white cloth snagged on the edge of the old hedge. She moved quickly, pushing through brambles. And there, just behind the overgrown yew, was a shallow depression in the ground. Freshly dug. She knelt, heart hammering. The earth was soft. She pulled back the top layer, inch by inch. A box, wooden, heavy, locked. Creech, now beside her, gasped. That wasn't there before. Theodora stood, brushing mud from her coat. Someone wanted to hide this. Not forever. Just long enough. She hauled the box out with Kerridge's help, both of them now drenched. Back inside the church, they pried it open. Inside were papers, hundreds of them. Letters, journal pages, music sheets. Gregory Bayliss's personal archive. Notes on his choirmates, marked with symbols. And tucked among them, a photograph. Lillian younger, standing beside Gregory, smiling, and behind them, almost forgotten, a third figure, face turned slightly, pale, thin, watching. It was Creech. Theodora looked up slowly, but Creech was gone. The doors slammed behind him, footsteps echoing down the nave. Kerridge ran after him, but Theodora stayed. Her hand rested on the photograph. It had all come full circle. The music, the secrets, the garden, the fear. And now a killer on the run, desperate, clever, and cornered. She whispered aloud, almost reverently. "The garden never forgets where you've walked." The rain softened into mist as the village of Marston Clay stirred under a clouded dawn. Its lanes slick and silent, the storm's rage replaced by a watchful hush. Theodora stood in the vestry, her eyes fixed on the open box of Gregory Bayliss's effects. Kerridge had returned moments ago, panting, empty-handed. Creech had vanished like a puff of smoke. No footprints in the mud, no coat left behind, only the echo of retreat. She touched the photograph again. 3 young faces, Gregory, Lillian, and Creech, frozen in a summer that now lay 20 years behind. But it was Creech's face that held her. Not just his presence, but his posture, leaning ever so slightly away from Gregory, as if even then he'd harbored something unspoken. Resentment, jealousy, fear. Beside the photo lay a stack of music sheets in Gregory's handwriting, some unfinished compositions, others marked with corrections. One bore the title, Hymn of Departure, scrawled in haste, with notations trailing off mid-bar. She thumbed through them, scanning for any note, any signature. A scrap tucked between 2 pages caught her attention, a small, folded program from a Christmas Eve concert 2 decades ago. The choir list included all the usual names: Dalrymple, Carruthers, Pye, and Creech listed not as organist, but as second tenor. She stilled. Creech had always claimed to have joined after Gregory's disappearance, never once admitting he sang in the same choir. Why lie? She flipped the paper over. Faint pencil markings, solo, Baylis, do not change. The words hung heavy, something slotted into place, not loudly, but with the quiet click of certainty. She retrieved Gregory's torn note, the one found behind the pipe organ. The incomplete phrase, "he's tack," had haunted her for days. Now it reasserted itself with chilling clarity. "He's taking it from me." Kerridge glanced over as she rose. "What is it?" She held out the program. Creech wasn't just an observer. He was a participant. He had a place in the choir, a voice. And then, he didn't. He said he joined later, but that's false. He was there, singing beneath the same roof as Gregory. So why hide it? Because something happened. Something that turned admiration into envy. Gregory was popular, promising. Creech wasn't. Maybe he believed Gregory had taken something that should have been his. A solo, a place of favor. Something intangible but vital to a man like Creech. She turned to the box again, lifting a sheet of music at random. There, at the bottom, Gregory had written, "Don't let Creech alter this again." Again. There had been arguments. She recalled an earlier conversation with Miss Pye. Something offhand about Creech's interference with the choir's tone. At the time, it seemed petty. Now, it echoed louder. Always fiddling with the harmony, like he wanted the whole church to bend around him. Theodora stepped outside. The air brisk and heavy with the scent of wet grass and stone. She crossed the square to the post office, where Mrs. Dalrymple was locking up early. "Miss Vane," the woman said, stiffly. "You'll forgive me if I don't offer tea." "I'm not here for tea, Margaret. I need to ask, what happened to Creech after Gregory vanished?" Margaret flinched. "I don't know what you mean." "You do. You know exactly what I mean. He was never arrested, never even questioned. Yet he altered records, erased names, buried memories. And you let him. Why?" The older woman's face cracked then, not with sorrow, but with weariness. "Because the past is a cemetery, Miss Vane. And some graves are better left undisturbed." "Except the grave isn't empty anymore," Theodora said gently. "It never was." She returned to the church, where Kerridge stood over the pulpit steps, holding a small, brass key. "Found it in Creech's drawer at the rectory," he said. "Doesn't match any of the doors." Theodora took it, the weight familiar. She turned slowly, scanning the nave. Her eyes settled on the carved wooden cabinet behind the altar, one rarely touched. A music chest. She approached and knelt, fitting the key into the lock. It opened with a soft click. Inside were dozens of scorebooks, many untouched. But one had a recent binding, a leather folio tucked among the old hymnals. She lifted it out. Theodora opened it and froze. Inside was a full transcript of a piece marked "Sanctuary." But the handwriting wasn't Gregory's, it was Creech's. The date on the bottom, December 24th, 1903. She scanned the pages. It wasn't just music, it was a confession. Woven into the bars between notations and breath marks were marginalia, phrases written in code, perhaps to evade discovery. She flipped further until the veil dropped completely. A note, written in small, firm letters. He threatened to report me, to expose what I had done. It was only a moment's rage, but it sealed us both. The stone would not break beneath my hands. So I buried the rest, in silence, in hymns, in forgetting. Kerridge exhaled beside her. He admitted it, but only to himself. Theodora said. Music was his sanctuary, his prison. He thought if he wrote it, he could contain it. But guilt doesn't fade with silence. Then her breath caught. There was one more sheet tucked at the back, a rough sketch of the garden before the renovations. The paths curved differently. One curved near the back wall, and beside it, a cross drawn in red ink. Beneath, in faint pencil, where the footsteps ended. They rushed out together, boots splashing through the puddles, until they stood once again in the sodden garden. Theodora moved to the spot indicated on the map. Kerridge took the spade from the toolshed without needing to ask. Within minutes, the earth gave way. A second box, smaller, older, rotted in places. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, were the bones. Human, long hidden. The silence between them deepened. Kerridge knelt, jaw tight. Gregory Bayliss. Theodora nodded. He never left the village. Creech made sure of that. The pattern had always been there, hiding beneath the music, the garden, the lies. A lonely man's pride, an impulsive crime, a conspiracy of silence stitched into Sunday robes and Christmas hymns. Now the last note had been sung. But the finale was yet to come. Theodora sat alone in the vestry, where long after the village constable had taken possession of the box and its grisly contents. The candlelight flickered across the faded hymnals and worn wood, as though the church itself were holding its breath. Outside, the mist had returned, blanketing Marston Clay in a hush so complete that even the bells dared not stir. She read the confession again, not for facts this time, but for tone, for shape. The notes in the margins, once cryptic, had taken on new meaning now that the body had been unearthed and the web of lies so tightly woven by Mr. Creech had begun to unravel. But it was not the act itself that haunted her. It was the reason behind it, still hidden in shadows. Creech had not returned. He had disappeared into the wet country night like a man folding into mist. No carriage, no witness. Just the distant echo of the rectory door shutting quietly behind him hours ago. If he had run, it wasn't far. Theodora doubted he ever truly wanted to escape. He was waiting, somewhere near, waiting for her to understand. She found herself returning to the small music folio, the one entitled Sanctuary. Beneath the coded confessions and careful notations was one line she had read a dozen times, but only now let herself fully absorb. He sang as though the music was his to give, and I knew then it would never be mine. It wasn't hatred that drove Creech, nor fear, it was longing. The realization swept over her like a cold wind through a broken window. This had never been about rivalry or jealousy in the common sense. It was something more intimate, more poisonous because it was silent and shamed. Creech had loved Gregory Bayliss, loved him in the way a man in 1903 could not speak aloud. Not in a village where every Sunday sermon sharpened the word sin like a blade. Not where whispers could flay more deeply than knives. And Gregory had known. Had perhaps returned the affection in friendship, perhaps not at all. But when he threatened to report Creech's meddling to the vicar, or perhaps something more personal, Creech had panicked. And in a single breath, the unbearable hope curdled into violence. Theodora recalled Lillian Bayliss's demeanor during their interview. The careful neutrality, the sudden bitterness when Theodora had mentioned how Creech had continued on at the church. Lillian had known too, or at least suspected. She had chosen, as so many had in Marston Clay, to bury it under layers of propriety and distance. The door creaked behind her. She turned slowly, unsurprised to find Creech standing there, water clinging to the shoulders of his coat, his hands empty, his eyes hollow. "You found him," he said. Not a question. Theodora nodded, quietly. He came forward, one slow step at a time, his gaze fixed on the closed folio on the table. "I thought," he said softly, "if I kept the music perfect, if I made the service beautiful, God might forget. Or at least forgive." She said nothing. The silence was not judgmental. It was waiting. He sat across from her, folding his hands neatly as if in prayer. He was going to leave the choir. Said he'd speak to the vicar about my conduct. He didn't say what he meant. I don't think he had to. I panicked. He turned away and I pushed, just once. But he hit the stone edge of the font. It wasn't meant to. His voice cracked. The lie within it too brittle to support the truth. Theodora waited, her voice quiet. But afterward, I couldn't move him alone. I panicked again. I took the keys, came back at night. I buried him in the garden. The next day, I rearranged the choir, burned the registers, erased his name from everything I could. I thought, if I made him vanish, perhaps I could vanish too. But you stayed, she said. He nodded, almost surprised. Yes, I couldn't leave. This church, it was all I had left. Even if it hated me, she studied him. You didn't kill him for reputation or to protect some secret. You killed him because you loved him and couldn't bear to see that love exposed or rejected. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The walls of the church had always echoed with music and secrets. But no one had truly listened, not until now. Theodora leaned back, exhausted and clear-headed. You'll have to surrender yourself. Creech didn't protest. Yes, he said. It's time. I buried the man. Then I buried myself. Perhaps they'll dig up both graves now. Theodora stood and opened the vestry door. Outside, the first hints of morning light touched the fog with rose. He paused as he passed her. Tell them he sang well, he said. Tell them his voice could lift stone. She nodded. He stepped out into the light. The fog parting briefly, as though even the mist knew it was time to reveal what it had long hidden. Theodora had not slept. Dawn had come and gone while she sat before the church's altar, sorting through the final fragments of the tragedy that had slowly emerged from the soil and silence of Marston clay. Creech's confession had illuminated the soul of the crime, but there was something still too polished about it, too convenient. Grief and shame. Yes, but also calculation. She trusted him to surrender himself. She did not trust him to tell the whole truth. The parish records from 1895 were still missing, pages burned, as he had admitted. But not all. A spare copy had been kept by the choir librarian, who had died years ago. His granddaughter, a girl Theodora remembered from her own Sunday school days, had recently returned to the village. She found her in the back room of the old greengrocer's house, sorting books, hair pinned up and sleeves rolled. When Theodora asked if she might look through the papers, the young woman merely handed her the box without a word. Theodora found it within the hour. A sheet tucked between two hymnals, yellowed, brittle, but unmistakable. The name, Gregory Bayliss, printed in steady copperplate. Dated 6 months before his supposed disappearance. Next to it, in a different hand, a note scrawled in the margin. Dismissed from choir, disciplinary reason, inappropriate conduct in vestry. That line changed everything. She stared at the words, the cold weight of them building like frost on a window pane. Creech hadn't merely pushed Gregory in a panic. There had been something else, something prior. An accusation, an investigation, and perhaps revenge. She returned to the rectory, where Constable Moore had posted a guard. Creech sat inside, quiet and pale, reading from an old psalter. He looked up as she entered, offering the ghost of a smile. "You've come to hear the rest, haven't you?" he said. Theodora said nothing at first. She placed the record on the desk between them. He stared at it as if it were a mirror. "I thought that had been destroyed." It almost was. Creech folded his hands. "Then you know," he made the accusation, "about me." Said I touched his shoulder too long in the vestry one night. Nothing more than that, But it was enough. Enough to remove him from the choir? No, he said flatly. Enough to remove me. The vicar asked me to step down. Temporarily, he said. Quietly. But I knew what it meant. So you buried the accusation and the accuser. His eyes met hers, not defiant, not ashamed, empty. I didn't plan it. Not at first. But when he returned weeks later, laughing about it, saying he'd only done it to watch me squirm, something in me snapped. He threatened to speak again, to go to the bishop. And I knew what would come. She studied him. And Lillian Baylis, she knew, or guessed. After he vanished, she came to me. Asked if I'd hurt him. I lied. She never forgave me. Though she could never quite prove anything either. We lived like strangers from that day. Theodora leaned forward. And the confession in the music folio? I wrote it for myself, not to be read. I think in some part of me I wanted it found. Not now, years from now. A footnote. A mistake recorded in fading ink. But the second murder forced your hand, she said. When someone dug up the bones, you had to act. To confess. I thought it was divine justice. But now I wonder. He trailed off. Theodora's voice sharpened. Freach. You didn't kill Jasper Goodwin. His head snapped up. What? Jasper was poisoned. By someone who wanted the body found. But also wanted you to take the fall. Creech stood slowly, trembling. Then who? The door creaked open behind them. Lillian Baylis stood in the threshold. Theodora did not turn. I was hoping she'd come. Creech's mouth worked soundlessly. Lillian. She stepped inside, hands bare, eyes calm. He was going to confess, she said. To the bishop, to the papers. Thought he'd clear his conscience, but it wasn't his conscience that suffered. It was mine. You, Creech whispered. He ruined our family, she said. Not just by dying, but by living as he did, making that accusation, disgracing you. And I believed it was true for a long time. Until I realized the real reason he said it. Because he wanted to be cruel. Because he enjoyed watching people crumble. You poisoned Jasper to reveal the grave. Theodora said softly. I needed them to dig, Lillian said. And I needed them to find what you buried, the truth. If you were ever going to be punished, it wouldn't be for a rumor. It had to be for the bones in the garden. Theodora turned to Creech. You were the monster in her memory. But she never considered whether you deserved it. Creech sat down slowly. I did. Even if I thought I didn't. I do now. Lillian's voice cracked. I wanted it to feel just. But it doesn't. Not anymore. Constable Moore arrived moments later. Having been summoned quietly by Theodora's note that morning. Lillian gave no protest as she was taken away. And Creech watched her go with tears that did not fall. That night, Theodora remained in the church long after the pews had emptied, the choir's voices having rung out once more with unfamiliar clarity. The case was done, but the echo of its pain would linger in those stones, in the garden, in the vanished footsteps that had once seemed impossible to trace, and in the silence between the hymns. Theodora imagined a voice that once sang with sorrow, and another that had loved it too much to let it speak. The dawn's pale light filtered through the stained, glass windows of Marston Clay's ancient church, casting fragmented hues across the cold stone floor. Theodora sat quietly in the worn pew, the weight of recent confessions pressing heavily on her thoughts. Creech's admission had unraveled much of the mystery, and Lillian Baylis's calculated intervention had brought a measure of justice. Yet, a gnawing unease lingered, a shadow in the corner of her mind that refused to fade. She reviewed every detail once again. The accusation from Gregory, the long-buried secret, the desperate act of poisoning Jasper Goodwin, and the confession hidden in music folios. All these pieces fit together too neatly, too conveniently. Something still felt off, as if the true story lay just beyond the edges of what had been revealed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Constable Moore, who approached cautiously, clutching an envelope with trembling hands. "Detective," he began, "there's been a development." Theodora rose, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" Moore handed her the envelope. Inside was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable, a figure standing near the churchyard on the night Jasper died. The figure's face was shadowed, but the posture, the gait, was all too familiar. "Who's this?" Theodora asked, studying the image. "That's the gardener, Mr. Harrow," Moore replied. "We didn't consider him much at first. He seemed harmless enough. But this photo was found on the camera of a tourist who passed through the village a week ago." Theodora's mind raced. Harrow had been quiet, almost invisible throughout the investigation. His neat garden and mild manners masked a history no one had bothered to uncover. Yet here he was, caught in the web of night and suspicion. She made her way to the small cottage at the edge of the village where Harrow lived alone. The garden bloomed in careful order, a stark contrast to the turmoil beneath. When she knocked, he answered with a calm that belied the tension in the air. "Mr. Harrow," Theodora began, "we need to talk about the events surrounding Mr. Goodwin's death." He nodded slowly, motioning her inside. The cottage was sparse, the walls lined with old photographs and gardening books, but no signs of disturbance. "I suppose you don't know why I'm here," she said, watching him closely. He smiled thinly. "Because the gardener is always the last suspect, miss. It's a cliché, but sometimes clichés are true." He sighed, settling into a chair. "I didn't kill Jasper Goodwin," he said flatly. "But I did know things. Secrets the village thought were buried." Theodora pressed for more. Harrow spoke of old grievances, forgotten debts, whispered betrayals, and a silent vendetta that had simmered beneath the village's polite surface for decades. He revealed that Lillian Bayliss had approached him weeks before the second murder, seeking help to expose Creech. But Harrow had refused, warning her that revenge could lead to ruin. "Did you see who poisoned Jasper?" Theodora asked. He hesitated. "No. But I suspect someone wanted the blame to fall where it did. The truth is messier than any of us realize." Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught Theodora's eye. A folded note slipped from a crack in the floorboard. She picked it up. The handwriting was hurried, the words chilling. "The choir hides more than voices. Watch the one who sings last." Harrow's eyes darkened. "I told you, miss. The Garden of Vanishing Footsteps is not just a place, it's a story. And the last to sing may hold the final note." Theodora left the cottage with the note burning in her palm, her mind unraveling new threads in the tangled web. The gardener's warning hinted at a deeper deception, one that had evaded every question and confession so far. Back at the rectory, she gathered her notes, piecing together the obscure references and subtle clues. The pattern began to emerge anew, not from the shadows of old grudges or straightforward confessions, but from the quiet spaces in between. A name resurfaced. Whispered and overlooked: Marianne Woodley, the village's new choir director. Marianne had arrived just weeks before the tragedy, her charm and meticulous nature earning trust quickly. Yet Theodora recalled the faint unease she'd sensed during their brief meeting, an elusive tension beneath the poised exterior. Determined, Theodora sought Marianne out at the choir hall, where the final rehearsal was underway. The music swelled around them, voices intertwining in haunting harmony. Marianne's gaze met hers, sharp and unreadable. "I hear you've been asking questions," Marianne said softly. "And I'm beginning to see the truth behind the music," Theodora replied. Marianne's smile flickered. "Sometimes, the most beautiful song masks the darkest secret." Theodora's heart pounded as she realized the final act was at hand. The real mastermind had played a subtle, dangerous game, manipulating the notes of suspicion to hide behind a chorus of lies. In the quiet that followed, Theodora knew the case was far from closed. The dance of shadows had only just reached its crescendo, and she was poised to confront the final, unexpected player who had orchestrated the entire tragedy from the wings. The Garden of Vanishing Footsteps had one last secret to reveal, and Theodora was ready to follow it to its bitter end. The dim glow of the fading afternoon settled over the village as Theodora prepared for what she knew would be the final confrontation. Every lead, every shadow of doubt, had converged on Marianne Woodley. The choir director's poised demeanor had masked something far more dangerous. An intelligence sharpened by years of concealment. A cold ambition that had shaped the tragedies that unfolded. Yet Theodora understood that exposing Marianne would require more than accusation. It would demand unraveling the invisible threads of deception that had ensnared everyone else. She returned to the rectory, where the worn table bore the weight of her gathered evidence. The folded note from Harrow, the cryptic hint about the choir and the one who sings last, had been the spark to ignite a fresh perspective. Marianne's involvement was not just a matter of timing or proximity, but of motive, cunning, and a deep-rooted grudge concealed behind her angelic farce aid. Pulling out the various notes and photos, Theodora traced the connections. Marianne's arrival, the timing of the deaths, the inconsistencies in her alibis, and the subtle manipulations of others, all pointed to a meticulous orchestration. Theodora's mind pieced together moments overlooked by the initial investigation, the misplaced sheet music found in Jasper Goodwin's study, the anonymous letters sent to Lillian Bayliss, the gardener's cautious warnings. But most telling was the pattern of footsteps, or rather, their absence, in the garden outside the rectory. The one place that should have yielded tangible traces was bafflingly bare. Marianne's familiarity with the grounds had allowed her to navigate unseen, slipping in and out without leaving the telltale marks that would have betrayed a less careful intruder. Theodora arranged the room's sparse furniture into a circle, inviting the key players to gather one final time. Creech, Harrow, Lillian, and even Gregory appeared, tension thick in the air. The detective's calm presence cut through the unease. She began by recounting the sequence of events with deliberate clarity. Each detail fell into place, from the poisoned wine to the second murder, from the cryptic note to the gardener's caution. As she spoke, eyes widened and lips tightened. The pieces finally aligned into a coherent whole. Then Theodora fixed her gaze on Marianne, who sat poised but visibly strained. "Your role was not just director of the choir, but conductor of this deadly symphony," Theodora said. "You orchestrated the deaths to conceal your own history. A past intertwined with the victims through a scandal long buried." Marianne's composure cracked for a fleeting moment. "You have nothing but assumptions," she replied, voice steady but eyes flickering. Theodora held up a final piece of evidence. An unsigned letter from years ago, discovered among Marianne's belongings. It revealed the truth. Marianne's family had been ruined by Jasper Goodwin's ruthless business dealings, leaving her with a legacy of humiliation and loss. Revenge had driven her calculated moves. Before Marianne could respond further, the door burst open. Constable Moore entered with urgent news. The gardener, Harrow, had fled. His small cottage lay empty, the garden trampled in haste, footprints leading toward the dense woods. Theodora's sharp mind grasped the implications instantly. Harrow, though peripheral, had become a wild card. His warnings, the hidden note, his sudden flight. It was clear he possessed knowledge dangerous enough to make him a threat to Marianne's plan. As twilight deepened, Theodora ordered a search. The village held its breath as officers combed the surrounding woods, the tension between capture and escape palpable. Hours passed with no sign. In the silence of the rectory, Theodora confronted Marianne once more, the detective's resolve unwavering. "You may have tried to control every step, but in your haste, you underestimated the unpredictable. Justice is more than punishment, it is the truth laid bare." Marianne's eyes softened, a shadow of regret crossing her features. "You see me as a villain, but I am a product of neglect, betrayal, and desperation." Theodora nodded solemnly. "And that story will be told. But for now, justice demands accountability." As the night waned, word came that Harrow was found near the riverbank, disoriented but unharmed. He refused to speak of Marianne, choosing silence over further chaos. His disappearance had been a desperate gambit, a final step in a complex game where no one was truly innocent. Theodora's closing remarks to the gathered villagers were measured yet firm. She detailed the subtle clues. The absence of footprints, the concealed letters. The orchestrated alibis that had pointed beyond the obvious. Her keen eye had uncovered the true conductor of the tragedy, while the unexpected player. Harrow remained a loose thread in the tapestry. As the villagers absorbed the revelation, a collective unease settled in. The case was closed. The villain exposed, but the shadows lingered. Theodora knew that in the quiet corners of the garden, footsteps might still vanish, secrets might still hide, and justice, while served, sometimes slipped just beyond reach. With a final glance at the fading dawn, Theodora stepped outside. The crisp air a reminder that every ending was but a prelude to another mystery waiting to be uncovered. The first light of dawn crept through the mist that clung to the village like a reluctant secret. Theodora's footsteps echoed softly against the cobblestones as she left the rectory behind, the events of the past days still vivid in her mind, the faces of those involved, the haunted, the broken, the deceivers, mingled in the early morning haze. Justice, it seemed, had been served, but as the chill wind whispered through the empty streets, she knew better than to believe any case truly closes without leaving a shadow. Her thoughts circled back to the fragments of the investigation that had never quite settled into place. The gardener, Harrow, had vanished briefly and returned with silence, and Marianne's final expression, half defiance, half remorse, haunted her. There was something intangible, a silent message beneath the words and actions, like a faint echo reverberating from the depths of a long-forgotten chamber. A detail overlooked, a motive yet concealed. As she walked past the village square, the fountain's trickling water mingled with her thoughts. Her eyes caught sight of a scrap of paper fluttering near a bench, seemingly out of place in the otherwise tidy scene. Curiosity drew her forward. The note was delicate, edges frayed, ink faded but still legible. Truth lies where silence speaks. Look beyond the surface. It was unsigned, cryptic as a riddle left by an unknown hand. Theodora folded it carefully into her coat pocket, a small smile touching her lips. This wasn't the closing of a story, but the opening of a new chapter. Whoever had penned these words understood the delicate balance between what was revealed and what remained hidden. Her pace slowed, the village awakening around her with the steady murmur of early risers. Yet, the familiar faces wore a different expression now, guarded, uncertain, as if sensing the fragile peace was but a veil. Theodora had seen this before: the calm before the storm, the quiet before another secret stirred. Her mind wandered to Jasper Goodwin's abandoned study, where the misplaced sheet music had sparked a crucial breakthrough. Had there been more there than a simple clue? And what of Lillian Baylis, whose subtle glances and half-truths suggested stories left untold? The puzzle pieces fit neatly enough to expose Marianne, but the edges were jagged. There were gaps in the mosaic no one had yet dared to explore. Ahead, the church bells began their solemn toll, marking the hour and summoning the faithful. Theodora paused beneath the great oak that shadowed the square. Its twisted branches, gnarled with age, seemed to cradle secrets of their own. She wondered how many times before the tree had witnessed similar tragedies, similar deceptions. From the corner of her eye, a shadow flickered near the tavern doorway. A figure she hadn't noticed before slipped away quickly, disappearing into the narrow alleyways that branched like veins through the village. Theodora's instincts sharpened instantly. There was always one more player in a tale this tangled, someone waiting for the right moment to step forward or vanish entirely. With practiced subtlety, she followed at a discreet distance, weaving through the awakening streets. The figure paused near the edge of the marketplace, glancing over a shoulder as if wary of being pursued. Then, just as quickly, the figure produced a small object from beneath their cloak, something glinting faintly in the morning light, and slipped it beneath a loose cobblestone. Theodora noted the spot carefully, committing it to memory. Whatever this was, it was meant to be hidden but not lost forever. The quiet weight of the moment pressed on her. This was no idle act but a deliberate message, a challenge wrapped in secrecy. Returning to the rectory, Theodora placed the folded note on her desk and lit a candle. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to breathe life into the room's silent corners. As she stared into the fire, the truth settled over her like a second skin, every mystery left behind a trace, no matter how faint. And sometimes, the faintest trace was the most dangerous. Her gaze drifted to the window, beyond which the village stretched. A tapestry of familiar streets and faces, each with its own hidden story. Justice might have claimed its due, but the echoes of this case would ripple far beyond the courtroom and the whispered confessions. Theodora knew the delicate threads she had followed would soon tug at another knot, another secret yearning to be uncovered. With a quiet resolve, she prepared to step once more into the labyrinth of human nature, where truth and deception danced endlessly. The case was closed for now, but the mystery, like the shifting shadows outside, was never truly finished. And so, as the village awoke and the day began anew, Theodora's thoughts lingered on the unseen forces that shaped every story. Because in the world of shadows and light, a detective's work was never done.